The tears that streaked down Penelope Davidson's cheeks caught the last rays of the setting sun, turning them to liquid gold as she stood frozen in the doorway of their farmhouse. It was 1875 in Independence, Missouri, and her world had just shattered with the back of her husband's hand across her face. "Crying again?" Victor Davidson sneered, his words slurring from the whiskey he'd been drinking since noon. "Those tears won't bring back the crops or pay our debts. They're useless, just like you." Penelope pressed a trembling hand to her stinging cheek, struggling to compose herself. At 23, she'd already endured 4 years of a marriage that had started with promises, but quickly descended into something unrecognizable. The drought that had devastated their farm this season had only made Victor more cruel, more unpredictable. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words automatic now. "The bank, they gave us another week." "Another week?" Victor laughed bitterly, reaching for the whiskey bottle. "What good is another week when we've got nothing to sell, nothing to mortgage, nothing but this worthless land and a wife who can't even give me a child?" Each word struck deeper than the slap had. Penelope backed away, her hands instinctively protective over her abdomen, the source of their greatest disappointment. The doctor in town had gently explained that her chances of bearing children were slim, and Victor had never forgiven her for it. "I'll find work in town," she offered, her voice barely audible. "Mrs. Wilkins at the general store mentioned—" "You'll do no such thing." Victor's fist came down on the table with such force that the plates jumped. "No wife of mine is going to work for wages. What would people say?" Penelope bit her lip to keep from pointing out the hypocrisy that his pride somehow mattered more than their survival. Instead, she quietly moved to salvage what she could of their dinner, a meager stew that had been simmering all day. "I received a letter from my sister in Colorado," she ventured cautiously as she ladled stew into his bowl. "She says there's work there, good land. Maybe we could—" "Colorado?" Victor scoffed. "You want me to abandon my father's land, run away like a coward? Is that what you think of me?" "No, You just nothing," he cut her off, shoving away from the table. The bowl of stew toppled, spilling across the worn tablecloth. "Clean this up. I'm going to town." Penelope watched him snatch his hat and storm out, the door slamming behind him with such force that the windows rattled. Only when the sound of hoofbeats faded did she allow herself to sink down onto a chair, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. This was her life now, so different from the dreams she'd had as a girl, reading dime novels about adventure and romance. She'd once believed in love, the kind that conquered all obstacles. Now, at 23, she felt ancient, her spirit worn down by disappointment and fear. She didn't hear the knock at first, so consumed was she by her grief. When it came again, louder, she hastily wiped her eyes and straightened her apron. Victor sometimes forgot his key when he'd been drinking, though he rarely returned so quickly. But it wasn't Victor who stood on her porch in the gathering dusk. Instead, a tall stranger removed his hat, revealing sun-bleached brown hair and eyes the color of the sky after a storm. He was dusty from the trail, his clothes weathered but well-kept. "Evening, madam," he said, his voice deep and gentle. "I apologize for the intrusion. Name's Thomas Calloway. My horse threw a shoe about a mile back. I saw your light and wondered if I might trouble you for some water and directions to the nearest smith." Penelope hesitated, keenly aware of her tear-stained face and the impropriety of receiving a male visitor alone. But there was something in his expression, a respectful distance, an earnestness that calmed her initial alarm. "Of course, Mr. Calloway. Please come in. I can offer water for both you and your horse." She stepped back, gesturing toward the kitchen. "I'm Mrs. Davidson. Penelope Davidson." Thomas stepped inside, careful to wipe his boots on the threshold. His gaze swept the modest farmhouse, taking in the upended bowl of stew, and Penelope realized with mortification the reddened mark on her cheek that Victor's hand had left. His eyes lingered there for just a moment, a flash of something concern, anger, crossing his features before his expression returned to polite neutrality. "Thank you kindly, Mrs. Davidson. I don't mean to be a burden." "It's no burden," she assured him, moving to fetch a pitcher of water. "Please sit. Are you hungry? There's stew." Thomas settled his large frame carefully onto one of the kitchen chairs. "I wouldn't want to impose. You wouldn't be, she said, finding herself suddenly eager for company that didn't involve fear or recrimination. I made plenty. It's simple fare, but hot. As she busied herself with fresh bowls and bread, she felt his gaze on her, not intrusive, but observant. When she turned back, he was studying a framed daguerreotype on the wall to her wedding portrait. She hardly recognized the hopeful young woman in the picture, standing proudly beside Victor. Your husband? Thomas asked. Yes, he's in town at the moment. Thomas nodded, accepting the bowl she offered with a grateful smile. This is mighty kind of you, Mrs. Davidson. They ate in a surprisingly comfortable silence for a few minutes. Penelope found herself stealing glances at her visitor. He wasn't handsome in the conventional way. His nose had been broken at some point, and weather had creased the corners of his eyes, but there was a steadiness to him that she found compelling. What brings you to Independence, Mr. Calloway? She asked, breaking the silence. Cattle, he replied. I work for the Circle B Ranch out of Colorado Territory. We're expanding our operation, looking for new breeding stock. He paused, then added, I'm actually headed to the Morris auction tomorrow. You're from Colorado? Penelope couldn't hide the interest in her voice. My sister lives near Denver City. Thomas's face brightened. Is that so? It's fine country out there. Different from here, bigger sky somehow, if that makes sense. It does, she said softly, thinking of her sister's letters describing vast open spaces and mountains that touch the clouds. She writes about it often. Before Thomas could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made Penelope freeze, her spoon clattering against the bowl. That would be my husband, she said, rising quickly. The door burst open, and Victor stood swaying in the doorway, his bloodshot eyes narrowing as they fixed on Thomas. What the hell is this? He demanded, staggering forward. Who are you, and why are you in my house? Thomas rose calmly, setting his napkin beside his empty bowl. Thomas Calloway, sir. Your wife kindly offered me some hospitality after my horse threw a shoe. I was just leaving. Victor's gaze darted between them, ugly suspicion blooming on his face. Hospitality? Is that what they're calling it now? Victor, please, Penelope whispered, mortification burning in her cheeks. Mr. Calloway just needed directions to town. And I'm sure you were eager to help, Victor sneered, advancing on her. Always so helpful to strangers, aren't you, Penny? Thomas stepped forward, his posture relaxed but somehow commanding the space between Victor and Penelope. Mr. Davidson, I assure you, your wife has been nothing but proper. She's been a credit to your home. Victor's face darkened. I don't need some drifter telling me about my wife. Get out of my house before I throw you out. Thomas nodded once, reaching for his hat. I'll be on my way. Thank you for the meal, Mrs. Davidson. Penelope couldn't meet his eyes, shame keeping her gaze fixed on the floor. You're welcome, Mr. Calloway. As Thomas moved toward the door, Victor roughly grabbed Penelope's arm. See what happens when I leave for an hour? Can't even trust my own wife. Thomas paused, turning slowly. Sir, there's no call for that. Your wife has done nothing wrong. This isn't your business, cowboy, Victor growled, his fingers digging painfully into Penelope's arm. I believe it becomes my business when I see a man mistreat a lady, Thomas replied, his voice level but with steel beneath it. Especially one who's shown me kindness. Victor released Penelope's arm with a shove, causing her to stumble backward. You've got some nerve. This is my house, my wife. She's not property, Thomas said quietly, his eyes flicking to Penelope's face, where tears had begun to well again. And those tears you seem to mock? They're the bravest thing I've seen in a long while. Penelope stared at him, stunned by the unexpected defense. No one had stood up for her in years, not since she'd married Victor and moved to his isolated farm, away from family and friends. Victor gave a harsh laugh. Brave? She cries if you look at her sideways. Useless? Weepy woman who can't even give me a child. Thomas's jaw tightened. I think I've overstayed my welcome. Mrs. Davidson, thank you again. He turned to Victor. Mr. Davidson, I suggest you reconsider how you speak to your wife. Good evening. With that, he placed his hat on his head and stepped out into the night, closing the door softly behind him. The silence that followed was deafening. Penelope could feel Victor's rage building like a summer storm, and she braced herself for the thunder. "So that's your plan?" he finally said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Entertain men while I'm gone? Make me a laughingstock in my own town?" "No, Victor, it wasn't like that," she pleaded. "He just needed directions." The back of his hand caught her across the mouth, splitting her lip. "Don't lie to me," he shouted. "I saw the way you looked at him, like some lovesick girl." Penelope tasted blood, her ears ringing from the blow. But something inside her, something that had been dormant for too long, suddenly flared to life. Perhaps it was Thomas Calloway's unexpected words, calling her tears brave. Perhaps it was simply that she had finally reached her limit. "I wasn't lying," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "And even if I had been looking at him, could you blame me? When was the last time you looked at me with anything but contempt?" Victor's eyes widened, unused to any resistance from her. Then his face contorted with fury. "You ungrateful!" His hand raised again, but this time Penelope didn't close her eyes or cringe away. She stood straight, meeting his gaze, prepared for the blow. It never came. Instead, the door flew open again, and Thomas Calloway stood there, his expression thunderous. "I forgot my—" He stopped, taking in the tableau before him. Victor, with his hand raised, Penelope with blood on her lip. "I see I've returned at an opportune moment." Victor turned, rage making him reckless. "Get out! This is between me and my wife." "Not anymore," Thomas said calmly, stepping inside. "Mrs. Davidson, is there somewhere you could go tonight? A neighbor, perhaps?" Penelope stared at him, astonished by his reappearance and the authority in his voice. "The Hendersons live 2 miles east, but—" "Good," Thomas nodded. "I think it would be best if you packed a few things and spent the night there." Victor lunged at Thomas, swinging wildly. "Who the hell do you think you are?" Thomas sidestepped the clumsy attack with ease, catching Victor's arm and twisting it behind his back in one fluid motion. Victor howled in pain, struggling uselessly against the stronger man's grip. "Mrs. Davidson," Thomas said, his voice strained but controlled as he held Victor immobile. "Please gather your things. I'll escort you to the Hendersons." Penelope hesitated only a moment before rushing to the bedroom. With shaking hands, she pulled a carpet bag from under the bed and stuffed it with essentials. A nightgown, a change of clothes, her hairbrush, the small box where she kept her mother's locket, and her letters from her sister. She could hear Victor's threats and curses from the kitchen, punctuated by Thomas's calm responses. Part of her couldn't believe what was happening, that she was leaving, that a stranger was defending her. But a deeper part recognized this moment for what it was: salvation. When she returned to the kitchen, Thomas had released Victor but stood between him and the door. Victor sat at the table, holding a cloth to his bleeding nose, his eyes burning with hatred. "You'll regret this," he spat at Penelope. "You leave now, don't bother coming back." She shouldered her bag, suddenly feeling lighter than she had in years. "I won't," she said simply. Thomas offered his arm. "My horse is just outside. It's not far to the Hendersons, is it?" "No," she confirmed, taking his arm with only slight hesitation. "Just along the east road." As they left the house, Victor's voice followed them. "She's barren, you know, useless as a wife." Penelope flinched but kept walking, Thomas's solid presence beside her, a comfort she hadn't known she needed. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding, stood patiently where he'd left it. "Can you ride, Mrs. Davidson?" Thomas asked, helping her with her bag. "Yes," she nodded, grateful now for her childhood on her father's farm, where she'd learned to ride before she could walk. "And please, call me Penelope." Thomas smiled then, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. "Penelope, then. Let me help you up." His hands were strong and sure as he boosted her onto the saddle, then swung up behind her. Penelope was acutely aware of his chest against her back, his arms reaching around her to take the reins improper by any standard. But in this moment, she couldn't bring herself to care about propriety. As they rode away from the farm that had been her prison for 4 years, Penelope felt tears streaming down her face again. But these were different tears, tears of relief, of possibility, of an unexpected freedom. "I meant what I said back there," Thomas said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. Your tears are brave. They show you still feel, still hope. That takes courage." Penelope didn't respond immediately, absorbing his words like as parched earth takes rain. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you for coming back." "I didn't intend to," he admitted. "I was halfway to town when I realized I'd left my father's knife on your table. Something told me to go back right away." He paused. "I'm glad I listened." They rode in silence for a while, the moonlight casting long shadows across the fields. Penelope's mind raced with questions, fears, possibilities. She had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope. The Henderson farm appeared in the distance, a welcoming light in the window despite the late hour. Thomas slowed the horse to a walk. "What will you do now?" he asked gently. Penelope took a deep breath, considering. "My sister has been asking me to join her in Colorado for years. Perhaps it's time I did." She felt rather than saw Thomas's smile. "Colorado's a fine place for fresh starts," he said, bringing the horse to a stop before the Hendersons' gate. "And as it happens, I'm heading back that way after the auction." Penelope turned slightly in the saddle to look at him, his face half illuminated by moonlight. "Mr. Calloway." "Thomas," he corrected with a small smile. "Thomas," she amended. "Are you offering to escort me to Colorado?" "I believe I am, Penelope," he said, his eyes serious. "If you want it. No obligations, no expectations, just safe passage to your sisters." The offer hung between them, weighted with possibility. In any other circumstance, Penelope would have considered it scandalous, improper a woman, traveling alone with a man who wasn't her husband. But after tonight, conventional propriety seemed a small concern compared to her safety and future. "Let me think about it," she said finally. I need to understand what I'm doing." Thomas nodded, respect in his gaze. "Of course. The auction ends the day after tomorrow. I'll be at the Independence Hotel until then." He dismounted first, then helped her down, his hands lingering just a moment longer than necessary on her waist. The touch, innocent as it was, sent a strange warmth through Penelope that she quickly tried to dismiss. "Thank you," she said again, retrieving her bag. "For everything." "You're welcome, Penelope," he replied, tipping his hat. "Remember what I said. There's strength in those tears." With that, he mounted his horse again and waited until she'd knocked on the Hendersons' door before turning back toward town, a solitary figure gradually swallowed by the night. Martha Henderson, a kind woman in her 50s who had always treated Penelope with motherly affection, opened the door with surprise that quickly turned to concern when she saw Penelope's split lip and tear-stained face. "Good heavens, child, what's happened?" She ushered Penelope inside, calling for her husband. "Is that blood? Come, sit down." As Penelope sank into a chair at the Hendersons' warm kitchen table, the events of the evening crashed over her. She began to cry again. But these tears felt different, cleansing rather than despairing. "Victor," she managed to explain between sobs. He hit me. Not for the first time. A stranger helped me leave." Martha's face hardened with anger, but her touch remained gentle as she cleaned Penelope's lip with a damp cloth. "I've suspected as much for some time. The way you flinch when anyone raises their voice. The bruises you try to hide." Penelope looked up, surprised. "You knew?" "I had my suspicions," Martha said grimly. "I should have said something sooner, asked you directly." Her eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Penelope." "It's not your fault," Penelope assured her. "I wouldn't have admitted it anyway. I was too ashamed." "Ashamed?" Martha's husband, John, entered the kitchen, his weathered face creased with concern. "Child, you've nothing to be ashamed of. The shame belongs to Victor Davidson." Penelope felt a wave of gratitude for these good people. "I don't know what to do now," she confessed. "Victor said not to come back." "Good riddance," Martha declared firmly. "You'll stay here as long as you need?" "I've been thinking." Penelope hesitated, then decided to trust these people who had shown her nothing but kindness. "My sister lives in Colorado. She's been asking me to join her for years." John nodded thoughtfully. "Colorado's growing fast. Good opportunities there." "The man who helped me, Thomas Calloway, he's returning to Colorado after the livestock auction. He offered to escort me." Penelope felt her cheeks warm as she added, "He works for a ranch there." Martha and John exchanged glances. "Do you trust this man?" John asked carefully. Penelope considered the question. She barely knew Thomas Calloway had spent less than 2 hours in his company. And yet, "Yes," she said with surprising certainty. "I do trust him." Martha patted her hand. "Then that's settled. You'll go to Colorado." She rose, practical as always. "But first, you need rest. Tomorrow, we'll go into town and speak with Sheriff Miller about what happened tonight." "The sheriff?" Penelope felt a flutter of panic. "Is that necessary?" "It is if you want a clean break," John said firmly. "We need to establish that Victor was abusive and that you left for your own safety. Otherwise, legally speaking, you're still his wife, abandoning your home." Penelope hadn't considered the legal implications. "What will happen to Victor?" John shrugged. "Depends on the sheriff, but at minimum, there should be a record of why you left." That night in the Hendersons' spare bedroom, Penelope lay awake, her mind replaying the events that had so dramatically altered her life's course. The memory of Victor's rage no longer terrified her, as it once had. Instead, she found herself dwelling on Thomas Calloway's words about her tears being brave, and the gentle strength in his hands as he'd helped her onto his horse. For the first time in years, she fell asleep thinking not of fear, but of possibility. Morning brought practical concerns. Martha lent Penelope a clean dress, as her hasty packing hadn't included anything suitable for town. After a hearty breakfast that Penelope could barely touch due to nerves, they set off in the Hendersons' wagon. Independence was bustling, the livestock auction having drawn people from across the region. Penelope kept her eyes downcast as they made their way to the sheriff's office, half afraid of encountering Victor on the street. Sheriff Miller was a gruff man with a handlebar mustache who had served in the Union Army. He listened to Penelope's account with increasing gravity, making notes in a small book. "This isn't the first complaint I've had about Victor Davidson," he said when she finished, surprising her. "Man's got a reputation for being free with his fists when he drinks, but without a witness willing to testify." He shrugged apologetically. "I witnessed her condition when she arrived at our home," Martha offered. "The split lip, the bruising." The sheriff nodded. "That helps, Mrs. Henderson." "And you say this Cowboy Calloway witnessed it too?" "He did," Penelope confirmed. "He's staying at the Independence Hotel until tomorrow." "I'll speak with him," Sheriff Miller promised. "In the meantime, Mrs. Davidson, I'll note that you've left your husband due to physical abuse. That should protect you from any accusations of abandonment." Relief washed over Penelope. "Thank you, Sheriff." "What about divorce?" Martha asked bluntly, ignoring Penelope's startled look. The sheriff tugged at his mustache. "Possible, especially with evidence of cruelty. But it's a lengthy process, and Mrs. Davidson would need to establish residency elsewhere if she's planning to leave Missouri." "I am," Penelope said softly. "I'm going to Colorado." Sheriff Miller nodded. "Then my advice would be to establish yourself there, then seek legal counsel. Colorado territory might have different requirements than Missouri." As they left the sheriff's office, Penelope felt oddly light, as though a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. The legal details were daunting, but for the first time, she could see a path forward. "We should visit the bank," Martha suggested as they walked back toward the wagon. "If you're leaving, you'll need funds." Penelope frowned. "Victor controls our account. He wouldn't have authorized me to withdraw anything." "Let's find out," Martha said determinedly, steering them toward the Independence Bank and Trust. To Penelope's surprise, Mr. Whitaker, the bank manager, was sympathetic to her situation. "Your father opened that account for you as a wedding gift, Mrs. Davidson," he reminded her. "While it's common practice for husbands to manage financial matters, legally the account remains in both your names." He allowed her to withdraw half the remaining balance, a modest sum, but enough to see her to Colorado and support her until she found employment. Penelope carefully tucked the money into the inner pocket Martha had sewn into her borrowed dress. As they exited the bank, Penelope caught sight of a familiar figure across the street, Thomas Calloway, engaged in conversation with a cattle broker. Even at a distance, there was something compelling about his presence, a quiet confidence that drew the eye. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, his expression brightening when he spotted her. With a quick word to the broker, he crossed the dusty street toward them. Mrs. Davidson, he greeted her, tipping his hat. I'm glad to see you well this morning. Mr. Calloway, she returned, suddenly aware of Martha's curious gaze. May I present Mrs. Henderson? She and her husband kindly took me in last night. Thomas shook Martha's hand warmly. Madam, I'm in your debt. I was concerned about Mrs. Davidson. It's we who are in your debt, young man, Martha replied, sizing him up with maternal scrutiny. Penelope told us what you did. Not many would have intervened. Thomas looked uncomfortable with the praise. Any decent man would have done the same. Would they? Martha asked skeptically. Well, in any case, Sheriff Miller would like to speak with you about what happened, to corroborate Penelope's account. Of course, Thomas agreed immediately. I was planning to visit his office this afternoon. He turned to Penelope. Have you considered my offer? About Colorado? Penelope nodded, aware of her racing pulse. I have. If the offer still stands, I would be grateful for your escort to my sister's home. Relief and something warmer flickered in Thomas's eyes. It stands. We'd leave the day after tomorrow, if that suits you. It does, she confirmed, feeling a curious mixture of nervousness and anticipation. I have preparations to make, but I'll be ready. They arranged to meet at the stage depot early on Friday morning. As Thomas bid them good day and returned to his business, Martha gave Penelope a knowing look. He's handsome, she observed as they climbed back into the wagon. Is he? Penelope pretended innocence, though she'd noticed the way the sun brought out gold highlights in his brown hair. Martha laughed. Don't play coy with me, child. Just be careful with your heart. You're vulnerable right now, and he's being kind. It's not like that, Penelope protested, though she felt her cheeks warm. He's simply helping me reach my sister. Martha said noncommittally. Well, we have much to do before Friday. You'll need proper traveling clothes, for one thing. The next day and a half passed in a flurry of activity. John Henderson drove to the Davidson farm when Victor was known to be in town, retrieving more of Penelope's belongings. Martha helped her alter an old traveling dress and coat to better fit the journey ahead. They purchased a new carpet bag and practical items Penelope would need on the trail. Throughout these preparations, Penelope found her thoughts continually drifting to Thomas Calloway. She'd glimpsed him once more in town, leading a string of newly purchased horses toward the livery stable. He'd seen her too, raising a hand in greeting, his smile causing an unfamiliar flutter in her chest. You hardly know him, she chided herself that night, packing her bag for the final time. This is gratitude, nothing more. But even as she tried to convince herself, she couldn't deny the strange anticipation she felt about the journey ahead, not just the destination, but the companion with whom she would share the trail. Friday morning dawned clear and cool, perfect traveling weather. The Hendersons insisted on driving her to town, Martha fussing over her like a mother sending a daughter to her first dance. You have the address for your sister? John confirmed as they approached the stage depot. Yes. And I've telegraphed ahead to let her know I'm coming, Penelope assured him. Her sister Louise's response had been immediate and enthusiastic, promising a warm welcome and a fresh start in Colorado Springs. Thomas was already waiting when they arrived, looking different in clean trail clothes, his hat pushed back to reveal his face in the morning light. He'd acquired a pack horse in addition to his bay gelding, loaded with supplies for the journey. Mrs. Davidson, he greeted her, then nodded respectfully to the Hendersons. Everything's arranged. The stage will take us as far as Kansas City. Then we'll continue by train to Denver City, and finally by horseback to Colorado Springs. Penelope turned to embrace Martha, suddenly emotional. How can I ever thank you both? By being happy, child, Martha whispered, hugging her tightly. And writing to let us know you're safe. The goodbyes were tearful but quick, as the stage driver was already calling for passengers. Thomas helped Penelope aboard, then secured their horses to follow behind the coach. As the stage pulled away, Penelope leaned out the window to wave a final goodbye to the Hendersons. When they were out of sight, she settled back against the leather seat, suddenly aware that she was embarking on a journey with a man she barely knew. Thomas seemed to sense her uncertainty. It's about 2 days to Kansas City, he said conversationally. The train portion will be more comfortable. Penelope nodded, grateful for the practical information. Have you made this journey often? A few times a year, he confirmed. Circle B Ranch sends me east regularly for livestock and supplies. The stagecoach held 4 other passengers, an elderly couple returning to their daughter's home in Denver, a young doctor headed to establish a practice in a mining town, and a drummer with cases of patent medicines and catalogs. The close quarters made private conversation difficult, which Penelope found something of a relief. It gave her time to observe Thomas without the pressure of constant interaction. She noticed the respectful way he addressed the elderly couple, offering the woman his canteen when the dust made her cough. She saw the patient manner in which he listened to the doctor's ambitious plans, neither encouraging nor discouraging, simply attentive. Most tellingly, she observed how he deflected the drummer's attempts to sell him miracle tonics, firmly but without rudeness. By the time they stopped at a way station for the night, Penelope had begun to feel she had indeed made the right decision in trusting this man. The way station offered basic accommodations, a common dining room, and separate sleeping quarters for men and women. After a simple but hearty dinner, Penelope excused herself, tired from the day's travel and the emotional toll of leaving her old life behind. In the small room she shared with the elderly woman, Mrs. Parker, she lay awake for some time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of travelers coming and going. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope not just for safety or absence of fear, but for genuine happiness. The journey to Kansas City passed without incident. Thomas proved to be a considerate traveling companion, attentive but never intrusive. They spoke of practical matters, mostly the route ahead, what she might expect in Colorado, how her sister's family would receive her. But occasionally their conversations deepened into more personal territory. "What made you become a cattleman?" Penelope asked on the second day, as they sat on the station porch during a driver change. Thomas considered the question, his gaze on the distant hills. "My father was a farmer in Pennsylvania. Good man, worked hard, but we never seemed to get ahead. When I was 16, a cattle drive came through our area. I was fascinated by those men, how free they seemed, how connected to the animals and the land." He smiled at the memory. "I begged to join them. My father thought I was crazy, but he gave his blessing. Said sometimes a man has to find his own path." "And did you? Find your path?" Thomas nodded. "I did. Started as a wrangler, learned everything I could. Worked my way up to trail boss by the time I was 22. Then the owner of Circle B took a liking to me, started sending me on more important errands." He glanced at her. "What about you? How did you end up in Independence?" Penelope looked down at her hands, considering how much to share. "My father was a teacher. We lived in St. Louis. After he died, my mother struggled to support us, me and my sister Louisa. When Victor began courting me, he seemed—" She paused, searching for the right word. "Solid, dependable. He had land, prospects. My mother was relieved when he proposed." "You married for security," Thomas observed. Not unkindly. "I thought I loved him," she admitted quietly. "Or perhaps I loved the idea of him. Either way, I was mistaken." Thomas's hand covered hers briefly, a gesture of comfort that ended before it could become improper, but left a lingering warmth. Sometimes our mistakes lead us to better paths, if we're brave enough to learn from them. Penelope met his gaze, struck by the sincerity there. "I hope you're right." In Kansas City, they transferred to the train, securing their horses in a livestock car. The faster, smoother travel allowed for more conversation, and Penelope found herself sharing stories of her childhood, her hopes for Colorado, even her painful secret about being unable to bear children, something she hadn't intended to reveal, but somehow felt safe confiding to Thomas. To her surprise, he didn't react with the disappointment or pity she had feared. "There are many ways to build a family," he said thoughtfully, "and many children in need of homes. My trail boss and his wife adopted 2 orphan siblings after a cholera outbreak. Fine young people now." His response eased something in Penelope, a knot of shame she'd carried since the doctor's diagnosis years ago. Perhaps her value as a woman, as a person, wasn't tied to her ability to produce children after all. The train journey took them through the vast prairies of Kansas and into eastern Colorado territory. As they traveled, Penelope noticed a subtle change in Thomas, a heightened alertness, a connection to the landscape that grew more pronounced as they moved west. "You love it here," she observed as they stood on the observation platform. watching the sun set over the distant mountains. "I do," he admitted, his face softened by the golden light. "There's something about this country that speaks to me, the space, the challenge of it, the way it demands your respect, but rewards your effort." Penelope studied his profile, seeing not just the cowboy who had come to her rescue, but a man with depth, with dreams of his own. "What do you want, Thomas? For your future?" The question seemed to surprise him. He was silent for so long that she thought perhaps he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, "Land of my own, a ranch, not as big as Circle B, but enough. A place where I make the decisions, raise good stock." He glanced at her, then back at the horizon. A home worth coming back to. The simple declaration stirred something in Penelope, a vision of what such a home might be like, what it might mean to be the reason someone wanted to return. She pushed the thought away, reminding herself that she was still legally married, still recovering from years of mistreatment. Such daydreams were premature at best, inappropriate at worst. In Denver City, they stopped for supplies before the final leg of their journey. The bustling frontier town was unlike anything Penelope had experienced, rougher than St. Louis, more vibrant than Independence, with a palpable energy of possibility. "Your sister lives in Colorado Springs," Thomas confirmed as they led their horses from the livery stable where they'd been kept during their supply run. "Yes, about a day's ride south," Penelope said, reviewing the directions in her sister's last letter. "She and her husband have a boarding house there." Thomas nodded. "I know the town well. The Springs has grown quickly with the new railroad spur. Should be plenty of opportunity for you there." They rode out of Denver as the afternoon lengthened, planning to make camp partway to Colorado Springs. Penelope, who had never camped outdoors before, watched with interest as Thomas efficiently set up a small fire and prepared a simple but satisfying meal of beans, bacon, and coffee. "You're staring," he observed with amusement as he poured her a cup of the strong, hot coffee. Penelope felt her cheeks warm. "I'm sorry. It's just, you make it all look so easy, being out here." "Practice?" He shrugged. "First time I tried to make camp alone, I singed off half my eyebrow and ate beans so undercooked they nearly broke my teeth." She laughed, surprised by the confession. "I can't imagine you being less than capable at anything." "Oh, there's plenty I can't do," he assured her, settling back against his saddle. "Can't dance worth a damn, can't read music, can't seem to remember the names of all my cousins, which causes no end of trouble at family gatherings." Penelope smiled, charmed by this glimpse of the ordinary man behind the heroic figure who had rescued her. "I can't whistle," she offered in return. "My sister tried to teach me for years, but I never managed more than blowing air." "A tragic deficiency," Thomas agreed solemnly, though his eyes crinkled with humor. "Almost as bad as my inability to tell identical twins apart, which once led to me calling Mrs. Thompson by her sister's name for an entire church picnic." Their shared laughter felt like the most natural thing in the world. As darkness fell completely, Thomas banked the fire and set up Penelope's bedroll a respectable distance from his own. "Sleep well," he said, tipping his hat before retreating to his side of the camp. "We should reach Colorado Springs by tomorrow afternoon." Penelope lay awake for some time, watching the stars wheel overhead through the branches of the cottonwood tree they'd camped beneath. The night was alive with unfamiliar sounds, the soft nickering of the horses, the distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of wind through grass. Strangely, she felt no fear, only a sense of expanding possibility. Her thoughts drifted to Thomas, sleeping just yards away. In less than a week, he had shown her more kindness, more respect than Victor had in 4 years of marriage. The realization both warmed and saddened her. "It's gratitude," she reminded herself again. "Nothing more." But in the honest darkness, she knew it was becoming something else, something both exhilarating and terrifying. Morning brought a spectacular sunrise that painted the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. Thomas was already up, tending the horses and rekindling the fire when Penelope emerged from her bedroll. "Coffee?" he offered, holding out a steaming cup. "Thank you," she accepted gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm tin mug. "How long have you been awake?" "Since first light," he said, turning his attention to preparing a breakfast of hardtack, softened in the coffee and the last of their dried apples. "Old habit. On the trail, You learn to use every hour of daylight. They ate quickly and broke camp efficiently, Thomas patiently showing Penelope how to roll her bedding tightly and secure it behind her saddle. His hands brushed hers occasionally during these lessons, each contact sending a small thrill through her that she tried hard to ignore. The ride to Colorado Springs took them through increasingly dramatic landscape towering red rock formations, giving way to pine-covered foothills, and always, on the western horizon, the majestic peak that gave the town its orientation. Pike's Peak, Thomas identified, following her gaze. Over 14,000 feet high. The local Ute people called it Tava Sun Mountain. You can see why. Indeed, the afternoon sun caught the snow on its summit, making it glow like a beacon. Penelope found herself wondering what it would be like to build a life in the shadow of something so magnificent. As they approached Colorado Springs, the trail widened into a proper road, and signs of settlement became more frequent isolated homesteads giving way to clustered buildings. Then finally the town itself, a planned community that showed its deliberate design in neat streets radiating from a central area. "It's lovely," Penelope breathed, taking in the tree-lined avenues and substantial buildings. Unlike the haphazard growth of many frontier towns, Colorado Springs displayed an air of permanence, of intention. General Palmer founded it just a few years ago, Thomas explained as they rode down the main street. Wanted to create a cultured resort town. There are mineral springs nearby, supposed to have healing properties. They asked directions to the address in Louisa's letters, and soon found themselves before a handsome 3-story boarding house on a corner lot, with a wide porch and carefully tended flower beds despite the late season. Penelope felt a sudden attack of nerves. She hadn't seen her sister in 4 years, not since Louisa and her husband had moved west, shortly after Penelope's wedding. What if Louisa had changed? What if her welcome wasn't as warm as her letters suggested? Thomas seemed to sense her hesitation. "Would you like me to wait?" he asked quietly. "Until you're sure." The offer touched her deeply. "No, but thank you. I need to do this part myself." He nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Then I'll take my leave. The Circle B is about half a day's ride from here. I should report back." For the first time, Penelope fully absorbed that their journey was ending, that Thomas Calloway, who had become so important to her in such a short time, was about to ride out of her life. The realization left her feeling unexpectedly hollow. "Thomas," she began, not sure what she wanted to say, only that she couldn't let him go without something. Before she could continue, the door of the boarding house flew open, and a woman who could only be Louisa rushed down the steps, her face alight with joy. "Penny! Oh my goodness, it's really you." Louisa enveloped her in a fierce hug, then pulled back to examine her face. "Let me look at you." Penelope laughed through sudden tears. "Lou? You haven't changed a bit." "Liar," Louisa grinned, touching her own rounded cheek. "I've gained 20 pounds and lost all my girlish elegance. But who cares? You're here." Her gaze shifted to Thomas, curiosity evident. "And who is this gentleman?" "This is Thomas Calloway," Penelope introduced him, suddenly shy. He helped me leave Victor and escorted me all the way from Independence." Understanding dawned in Louisa's eyes. She knew from Penelope's letters something of Victor's true nature, though Penelope had always downplayed the worst of it. "Mr. Calloway," she said warmly, extending her hand, "it seems I owe you a debt of gratitude." Thomas shook her hand. "No debt, madam. It was my honor to escort Mrs. Davidson safely to you." "You must stay for dinner," Louisa insisted. "James will want to thank you properly, and we have plenty of room." Thomas glanced at Penelope, then back to Louisa. "That's kind of you, madam, but I should return to my employer. They're expecting me." "Nonsense," Louisa declared. "Surely one night won't matter. After such a journey, I insist." Penelope found herself holding her breath, hoping he would agree, not ready to say goodbye just yet. Thomas hesitated, then nodded. "One night, then. Thank you." Louisa beamed. "Wonderful. Now come inside, both of you. You must be exhausted." The boarding house was as warm and welcoming inside as out, with polished wood floors, comfortable furnishings, and the delicious smell of something baking wafting from the kitchen. Louisa's husband James, a genial man with spectacles and a ready smile, greeted them enthusiastically, ushering Thomas off to see to the horses, while Louisa showed Penelope to a cozy bedroom on the second floor. "This will be yours for as long as you need it," Louisa said, setting Penelope's bag on a patchwork quilt. "Though I hope you'll consider making your home with us permanently." "Lou, I can't impose." "Impose? Penny, I've been begging you to come for years." Louisa sat on the bed, patting the space beside her. "Now, tell me everything. Your telegram was maddeningly brief. Leaving Victor, arriving Friday with escort." I nearly died of curiosity. Penelope sank down beside her sister, suddenly overwhelmed by the events that had brought her here. "It's a long story," she warned. "I have time," Louisa said gently, taking her hand. So, Penelope told her everything: Victor's increasing cruelty, the drought that had worsened his temper, Thomas's timely appearance, and her escape. She found herself glossing over the growing feelings she harbored for Thomas, but Louisa, who had always been able to read her like a book, noticed anyway. "You care for him," she observed when Penelope had finished. "I barely know him," Penelope protested weakly. "And yet," Louisa smiled knowingly. "Don't worry, I won't tease. Much." Her expression sobered. "But, Penny, you're still legally married. That complicates matters." "I know," Penelope sighed. "The sheriff in Independence suggested I establish residency here before pursuing legal options." "That's wise," Louisa agreed. "Colorado has more progressive laws regarding divorce than Missouri, especially in cases of cruelty. James knows a good lawyer who can advise you." Dinner that evening was a pleasant affair, with just the four of them gathered around Louisa's dining table. James proved to be as welcoming as his wife, regaling them with stories of the town's rapid growth and the colorful characters who passed through their boarding house. "We've had everyone from English lords to mining prospectors," he chuckled. "Last month we hosted a botanist who spent every day collecting plant specimens and every evening pressing them between the pages of our books without asking first, mind you." Thomas, Penelope noticed, was reserved at first, but gradually relaxed as the meal progressed. By dessert, Louisa's famous apple pie, he was sharing stories of his own adventures on cattle drives that had them all laughing. And then the cook, we called him Sourdough Pete, looks at this young wrangler covered head to toe in mud and says, "Boy, I can't tell if you're the rider or the horse." Thomas finished, his eyes crinkling with mirth. As their laughter subsided, James regarded Thomas thoughtfully. "How long have you worked for Circle B, Mr. Calloway?" 8 years now," Thomas replied. "Started as a regular hand, worked up to special assignments like this purchasing trip." "Good outfit?" James inquired. "One of the best," Thomas confirmed. "Fair pay, decent treatment. Mr. Buchanan runs a tight operation, but he rewards loyalty." James nodded approvingly. "The territory needs more men like that. Too many outfits work their hands to death for starvation wages." The conversation continued companionably until late in the evening. When they finally retired, Penelope found herself lingering in the hallway, reluctant to end the day knowing Thomas would leave in the morning. "Thank you again," she said softly, aware of Louisa and James's door closing down the hall, "for everything." Thomas stood close enough that she could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, even in the dim light of the wall sconce. "You've thanked me enough, Penelope. I'm just glad you're safe now. Will you—" She hesitated, then pressed on. "Will you come back? To visit, I mean." Something flickered in his expression. Hope, perhaps, or longing. "Would you want me to?" "Yes," she admitted, her heart pounding. "Very much." Thomas reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she chose, and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The simple touch sent warmth cascading through her. "Then I will," he promised. "Circle B isn't far. I can ride in when duties allow." Penelope smiled, relief and anticipation mingling in her chest. "Good night, Thomas." "Good night, Penelope," he returned, his voice low and warm. "Sleep well." Morning came too quickly. Thomas was ready to depart after breakfast, his saddlebags packed with provisions Louisa had insisted on providing. James and Louisa discreetly busied themselves inside, giving Penelope and Thomas a moment of privacy on the porch. "Your sister and her husband are good people," Thomas observed, adjusting his horse's bridle. "You'll be well cared for here." "Yes," Penelope agreed, watching his capable hands at work. "Louisa says there's a position at the school, if I want it, teaching music." Thomas smiled. "You never mentioned you were musical." "There's still a lot we don't know about each other," she replied softly. "I look forward to learning," he said, his gaze holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. Then, seeming to recollect himself, he added more lightly, "Next time I visit." Penelope nodded, not trusting her voice. Thomas mounted his horse, settling his hat more firmly on his head. "Take care, Penelope Davidson," he said, tipping the brim to her. "And you, Thomas Calloway," she returned, trying to smile through the unexpected ache in her chest. She watched him ride away, his straight-backed figure gradually diminishing as he headed north out of town. Only when he had disappeared from view did she turn back to the boarding house, where a new chapter of her life awaited. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of adjustment. Louisa and James welcomed her fully into their home and business, introducing her to their friends and helping her establish herself in the community. The teaching position at the local school materialized as promised, and Penelope found she had a gift for drawing music from even the most reluctant students. As October gave way to November, she consulted with the lawyer James had recommended about her situation with Victor. Mr. Harrison was a kind but shrewd man who laid out her options clearly. "Colorado territory requires 3 months residency before filing for divorce," he explained. "Given the circumstances you've described, the physical abuse, the abandonment, you have strong grounds. Mr. Calloway's testimony would strengthen your case further." Penelope nodded, both relieved that a path forward existed and daunted by the process ahead. "And if Victor contests it?" Mr. Harrison's expression hardened slightly. "Let him try. Our courts take a dim view of men who mistreat their wives, but based on your account, it sounds more likely he'll be glad to be free of the responsibility." She hoped the lawyer was right. The last thing she wanted was Victor appearing in Colorado to cause trouble. November brought the first real snow, transforming Colorado Springs into a winter wonderland that delighted Penelope despite the cold. She had just returned from school one Friday afternoon, stomping snow from her boots on the boarding house porch, when she looked up to see a familiar figure dismounting from a bay gelding at the hitching post. "Thomas," she called, unable to contain her joy as she hurried down the steps, propriety forgotten. He turned, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "Penelope," he greeted her, removing his hat. "You look well." "So do you," she returned, drinking in the sight of him. If anything, he seemed even more handsome than she remembered, his lean face bronzed from outdoor work, his eyes bright against his weathered skin. "I can only stay until tomorrow," he said apologetically. "There's a herd coming in that needs processing before the worst of winter sets in." "You're here now," she said simply. "That's what matters." Louisa, alerted by their voices, appeared at the door. "Mr. Calloway, what perfect timing. We're just about to serve dinner." That evening was the first of many visits over the winter months. Thomas came whenever his duties at Circle B permitted, sometimes just for an afternoon, sometimes staying overnight in the boarding house. Each visit deepened their connection, building a foundation of shared experiences and growing affection. They were careful to maintain propriety, never alone together, except in public places, always with Louisa or James as chaperones. But within those boundaries, their feelings blossomed undeniably. Thomas told her of his dreams for his own ranch, of the land he'd been saving to buy near the foothills, where water was plentiful and grazing good. Penelope shared her growing confidence as a teacher, her delight in her students' progress, her slowly healing sense of self-worth. December brought news that stunned Penelope. Victor Davidson had been killed in a barroom brawl in Independence. The telegram from Sheriff Miller was brief, but clear. An argument over a card game had escalated, and Victor, drunk and belligerent, had pulled a knife. The other man had shot him in self-defense. "I don't know what to feel," Penelope confessed to Louisa after reading the telegram. "I never wished him dead, but you're free," Louisa finished gently. "It's all right to feel relief, Penny. That doesn't make you a bad person." When Thomas visited next, Penelope shared the news with him during a chaperoned walk through the snow-covered town square. "I'm sorry," he said, his breath fogging in the cold air. "Are you?" she asked, genuinely curious. Thomas considered the question seriously. "I'm sorry for the waste of a life, for the boy he might have been before. Whatever hardened him turned him cruel. But I'm not sorry you're free of him." He paused, then added more quietly, "And I'm not sorry that there's no longer an obstacle between us." Penelope's heart raced at the implication. "Thomas—" He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. Snow drifted around them, catching in his hair and on the shoulders of his coat. "Penelope, I've been careful not to speak out of turn while your situation was complicated, but I think you know how I feel." She did know, had seen it in his eyes, felt it in the careful distance he maintained even as they grew closer. "Yes," she whispered, "I know. I'm not a wealthy man," he continued, "but I have savings and prospects. In the spring, I'll have enough to make an offer on that land I told you about, to start building something of my own." Penelope held her breath, hardly daring to hope for what seemed to be coming. "I don't expect an answer now," Thomas said, reaching for her gloved hand. "But when the time is right, when you've had proper time to mourn if that's what you need, I'd like to court you openly, with honorable intentions." Joy bubbled up inside her, unexpected and overwhelming. "I don't need time to mourn, Thomas. Victor and I were finished long before he died. And as for your intentions—" She squeezed his hand, smiling through sudden tears. "I welcome them." The look of pure happiness that transformed his face was something Penelope knew she would remember always. Right there in the town square, with Louisa watching indulgently from a discreet distance, Thomas raised her hand to his lips in a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply moving. "Then, may I call on you properly tomorrow?" he asked. "Take you to dinner at the hotel restaurant?" "Yes," she agreed, unable to stop smiling. "I'd like that very much." Their courtship progressed swiftly, built on the solid foundation of friendship and mutual respect they'd already established. By February, Thomas had secured a promise from Mr. Buchanan to release him from his duties at Circle B by April, in time for the spring planting on what would be his own land. In March, on a day when the first crocuses were pushing through the melting snow, Thomas took Penelope to see the property he intended to buy, 160 acres of rolling foothills, with a year-round creek, a stand of pines for building, and views of the mountains that took her breath away. "It needs work," he cautioned as they stood on a rise overlooking what would become their homestead. "The cabin's just a shell, the fencing is half done at best, and the barn needs a new roof before it can shelter stock." Penelope turned in a slow circle, envisioning not what was, but what could be a proper house rising from the cabin's bones. Flowers blooming along stone-lined paths, children's laughter echoing across the meadow. "It's perfect," she declared, facing him with shining eyes. "Absolutely perfect." Thomas's expression softened, and he reached into his pocket. "I was hoping you'd say that," he said, drawing out a small velvet box that looked incongruous in his work-roughened hand. "Because I'd like this to be our home, together." Penelope's heart seemed to stop, then race ahead at twice its normal speed as Thomas opened the box to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small but flawless diamond. "Penelope Davidson," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "I've loved you since the moment I saw you standing brave in your kitchen, despite everything. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation, tears of joy spilling down her cheeks. "Yes, Thomas Calloway, I will." He slid the ring onto her finger, then drew her into an embrace that conveyed all the tenderness, passion, and promise that propriety had forced them to restrain until now. When their lips met for the first time, Penelope felt as though something long broken inside her was finally, perfectly mended. "Those tears again," Thomas murmured against her hair when they finally drew apart. "Still the bravest thing I've ever seen." Penelope laughed softly, pressing her face into his shoulder. "They're happy tears this time, very happy. I plan to ensure they always are," he promised, his arms tightening around her. "From this day forward." They were married in April, with Louisa and James standing beside them in the small stone church in Colorado Springs. The ceremony was simple, but deeply meaningful, with vows they had written themselves that spoke of respect, partnership, and abiding love. Not property, but partners, Thomas had insisted on including, a direct refutation of Victor's cruel worldview that had moved Penelope to fresh tears, even as she smiled through them. Their wedding night was a revelation, gentle, passionate, and healing. Thomas's patience and tenderness helped Penelope overcome the last of her fear, transforming intimacy from something to be endured into something to be celebrated. "I never knew it could be like this," she whispered in the quiet aftermath. Nestled against his chest as moonlight spilled through the window of the hotel room James had insisted on providing as a wedding gift. Thomas pressed a kiss to her forehead. "It always should have been," he said simply, "and always will be, between us." Spring and summer were consumed with building their new life together. They worked side by side to transform the shell of a cabin into a proper home, with Penelope proving surprisingly adept at practical matters like chinking logs and mixing plaster. Thomas, true to his word, treated her as an equal partner in all decisions, from the layout of rooms to the selection of their first small herd of cattle. By autumn, their ranch, which they named Braveheart in a private joke between them, was taking shape. The cabin had expanded into a comfortable 4-room house. The barn stood solid and weatherproof, and 20 head of prime breeding stock grazed in fenced pastures. Thomas had hired 2 young cowboys to help with the heavier work, and Penelope continued teaching music at the school 3 days a week, riding the 4 miles each way with joy rather than resentment. As winter approached again, they sat together on the porch they had built that summer, watching the sun set behind the mountains in a blaze of gold and crimson. Thomas's arm was around her shoulders, Penelope's head resting against him in comfortable silence. "I have news," she said finally, turning to look up at his face. "Good news, I hope?" he asked, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. Penelope smiled, taking his hand and guiding it to rest over her still flat abdomen. "The best news. Dr. Phillips confirmed it yesterday." Thomas's eyes widened, hope and disbelief warring in his expression. "But you said the doctor in Missouri told you that the chances were slim," she finished. "Not impossible. And it seems he was wrong. We're going to have a baby, Thomas, in late spring." For a moment he seemed unable to speak, his eyes suspiciously bright in the fading light. Then, with a sound that was half laugh, half sob, he gathered her into his arms, holding her as though she were the most precious thing in the world. "A baby," he whispered against her hair. "Our baby." Penelope held him just as tightly, marveling at how completely her life had transformed in the span of a year, from fear to safety, from loneliness to love, from despair to this perfect, overwhelming joy. "Are you crying, Cowboy?" she teased gently. Feeling the dampness against her temple, Thomas drew back just enough to meet her gaze, not bothering to hide the tears that tracked down his weathered cheeks. "Seems you've taught me about brave tears too," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "about how sometimes joy is too big for anything else." Penelope reached up to touch his face, wiping away a tear with her thumb. "I love you, Thomas Calloway." "And I love you, Penelope Calloway," he returned, his hands cradling her face as he lowered his forehead to rest against hers. "More than I have words to say." As twilight deepened around them, they remained on the porch, planning and dreaming of the nursery they would add to the house, of the garden they would plant in spring, of the child who would grow up surrounded by love and respect and the vast beauty of the Colorado wilderness. Later, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Thomas's hand resting protectively over the place where their child grew, Penelope reflected on the strange, winding path that had brought her here, how a moment of great pain had ultimately led to her greatest happiness. "What are you thinking?" Thomas murmured, his voice drowsy with contentment. "That sometimes," she replied, nestling closer to his warmth, "our deepest wounds lead us to our truest healing, and that I wouldn't change a single step of the journey that brought me to you." Thomas pressed a kiss to her shoulder. "Nor I, though I wish I could have spared you the pain." "You did better than that," she assured him, turning in his arms to face him. "You showed me that the pain didn't define me, that my tears weren't weakness but strength. The bravest thing I've ever seen," he quoted himself with a smile she could feel rather than see in the darkness. "And the most beautiful words I've ever heard," she returned, sealing the sentiment with a kiss that conveyed all the gratitude, love, and promise that filled her heart. Outside their window, the first snow of winter began to fall, each flake a tiny miracle of beauty and possibility, much like the life they had built together and the future that stretched before them, bright with hope and richer than either had dared to dream. In the years that followed, Braveheart Ranch prospered and grew. Thomas's careful management and Penelope's practical support transformed their modest beginning into one of the most respected small operations in the territory. Their herd expanded, their house added rooms to accommodate their growing family, and their reputation for fair dealing and quality stock spread throughout the region. Their son, James Thomas Calloway, was born on a perfect May morning in 1877, with Louisa serving as midwife, and Thomas pacing the porch until the newborn's lusty cry announced his arrival. When Thomas first held his son, the expression of wonder on his face moved everyone to tears, brave tears, as Penelope now thought of them. 2 years later, their daughter Sarah Louise joined the family, followed by twin boys, Michael and Matthew, in 1882. The doctor who had once told Penelope she would likely never bear children was proven spectacularly wrong, a fact that brought her no small satisfaction. But their family grew in other ways too. In 1883, a cholera outbreak in a mining camp left 3 children orphan siblings aged 12, 9, and 6. When no relatives came forward, Thomas and Penelope opened their home and their hearts, eventually adopting all 3 formally. "Every child deserves brave love," Thomas said simply when asked about their decision, "the kind that stands firm through hardship and never wavers." As their children grew, so did the stories of how their parents had met, how a cowboy had defended a woman's tears as brave, how that defense had blossomed into a love story that became family legend. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children and grandchildren gathered at Braveheart for a celebration. The original cabin, now expanded into a comfortable ranch house, was filled with laughter, music, and the chaos of multiple generations. After dinner, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold, Thomas took Penelope's hand and led her to the old porch swing they had installed when James was still a baby. "Look at what we've built," he said quietly, gesturing toward their family scattered across the lawn, James discussing cattle prices with his father-in-law, Sarah teaching her niece to make daisy chains, the twins arguing good-naturedly over whose turn it was to tell a particularly embellished story of their youth. "It's more than I ever dreamed," Penelope admitted, leaning against his shoulder. At 48, she was still beautiful to him, the silver threading through her dark hair only adding to her grace in his eyes. "Do you ever wonder," Thomas asked, his voice thoughtful, "what would have happened if I hadn't forgotten my knife that night? If I hadn't gone back?" Penelope considered the question. "Sometimes," she acknowledged, "but then I remember what you always say about brave tears." Thomas smiled, the crow's feet at the corners of his eyes deepening. "That they're a sign of strength, not weakness. And that they mean you still feel, still hope," she continued, reaching up to touch his face. "I think I would have found my way eventually, found my courage, but I'm grateful beyond words that I've found you too." Thomas turned his head to press a kiss to her palm. "As am I, my love, as am I." As darkness fell and lanterns were lit across the yard, casting golden pools of light where their family gathered, Penelope and Thomas remained on the porch, hands clasped, hearts full. The journey from that kitchen in Independence to this moment had been long, with its share of challenges and sorrows along with the joys. But through it all, they had faced life together, with courage, respect, and a love that had only deepened with time. And whenever tears came, whether from joy or sorrow, from pain or healing, they were acknowledged for what they truly were, the brave evidence of a heart fully engaged with life, fully open to love, and fully alive to the beauty of the world they had built together.